our last video, we mainly discussed the correlation of Odin's name to the psychedelic experience and what that says about Odin himself. And then towards the tail end, we kind of tapered off into a purely theoretical and speculative realm. For those of you who found that entertaining, I appreciate it. For those of you who did not, good news is we're not going to do that in this video. We're going to stick pretty much fact-based from here on out. Yet for the most part, the biggest and most significant aspect which links Odin to psychedelics is the experience of Odin, or the character of Odin, the traits of Odin, and the experience of psychedelic and all the character traits that entails as well. Yet within Odin's nature and the stories that are concerning Odin, it becomes abundantly clear that he is not just your average god, that he has different aspects, that he is extremely layered, sophisticated, complex, and we see some absolutely profound metaphors when we're actually looking at Odin. And when we're analyzing the mythologies and the tales within the mythologies, certain pieces of the puzzle start to piece together, and if you're looking at it through the lens digesting or interpreting it as a psychedelic phenomenon, all of a sudden it becomes abundantly clear with each little step that we take. And of course I have to reiterate, as I talked about in part 1, we mentioned again in part 2, we have to open up part 3 with this as well, that the ancient people, especially the ancient pagans, their mythologies were metaphorical. They symbolized things. So everything that we see in these stories are figures of speech. They are metaphors. They symbolize elemental forces within ourselves and within nature, and perhaps experiences. Yet if we break it down and we look at Odin specifically, we see that he is a wanderer. He is a divine vagabond. He is a bohemian, so to speak. He is always traveling, always journeying. And the question that we have to ask is, could this be symbolic for psychological journeying, for perspective wandering, from perception and how he sees the world, and the way that a psychonaut would alter and travel and explore these different aspects? Could all of this be correlated with Odin in a symbolic level? That's the question we're trying to answer. But Odin is oftentimes confused with having minimal aspects in the stories, especially in the Icelandic, the Nordic stories. He oftentimes plays a minimal role, where he's simply a war deity, or he's simply the one hanging on the Yggdrasil trying to get the wisdom of the runes, because a lot of times people misconstrue the name Odr, O-D-R, as a different god from Odin. And that of course is Frigg, or Freya's husband, which is Odin. That's just a different name for Odin. So a lot of times people reading the sagas and so forth, and the Poetic Edda or the Prose Edda, they'll see Odr and they won't realize that that is in fact Odin. So when you're reading these stories of this other wandering god, this other god that's traveling around and whose wife is searching for him all the time, this is Odin. That is the story of Odin. Now, time for a thought experiment. Simply replace the name Odr with Odin. All of a sudden everything trying to kind of make sense. So Freya is roaming the world searching for her husband, who's a vagabond, who's a vagrant, who's a traveler, who's a wanderer. And she's wandering the world, and she's sad because she can't find him, and she's crying, and everywhere she cries she's depositing gold because she weeps tears of gold. And that of course is the ancients' mythological explanation for the deposits of gold found all over the world. So she's traveling far and wide, as far as the human imagination can go, and of course she finds Odin finally, and he's sitting in a yogi stance beneath a tree and seemingly having an out-of-body or extra psychical experience. He's out of his head, he's meditating, he's in a different realm, so to speak. This, of course, if we're looking at it from a psychedelic point of view, seems that he's having a psychedelic experience. And of course, the act of sitting under a tree in a yogi-like position in a seemingly meditative state, this is connected with shamanic practices. Again and again and again, we see shamanic deities like Cernunnos, for instance, sitting in a loaded lotus position, sitting in with his legs crossed, his hands down, or in Cernunnos' case, his hands up, holding things like a snake and a torque. But we see this in shamanic elements again and again and again and again. So this again further connects Odin to the shamanic experience. Yet we can see that he's having a type of meditative quality where he's having an introspective phenomenon, or maybe he's lost in vision. He could be having an out-of-body experience, but nonetheless, as she finds him beneath the tree, and again, this is important to note that he's beneath a tree. This also equates him to the shamanic practices that were practiced in Lapland up until very, very recently, and there's now a resurgence in this aspect too, where the Lapland shamans are sitting beneath trees, they're going to mountaintops, they're going to these holy open-air places, and that's where they have their divine shamanic experience. Odin's beneath a tree, and in this he seems to be having an out-of-body experience. Could this be how he wanders, how he travels, how he goes from to and fro in these different realms? Because we do know that Odin has the capacity to go between realms. He's not stuck in the mortal realm, he's not stuck in the god realm. He has access to all these different realms. Could it be that he's psychologically projecting to get to these extra realms? And another thing that I find interesting is that oftentimes in order for Odin to reach these other realms, he is shown taking a substance. He's shown doing a practice. He has to achieve a feat before he can go to this other place, this other realm, this other universe, this other layer in the cosmos, so to speak. So he's consuming substances, he's performing practices, and these are seemingly giving him an out-of-body or extra-psychical experience. All of this seems to point to a psychedelic phenomenon. Yet Odin also receives a connection to the psychedelic experience via his connection to Mars and Mercury from the Greco-Roman mythology. Now when it comes to Mars, when we're looking at him, he seems to be more of a war deity. And of course, this is probably why he was paralleled to Odin. But stories of magic herbs riddle his backstory, from his mother receiving him via magic herbs, to various love potions that he employed throughout his life, to healing potions. But with Mercury, he is a god directly associated with magic. And he's also known as Hermes. Those two seem to be one and the same. And he was also a guide of the dead. In other words, he was a psychopomp. Now then, we can connect this with psychedelic mushrooms, for instance psilocybin, because these mushrooms still to this day are used to lessen the blows of death. They're used to treat terminal cancer patients and allow them to accept the prospect of going on into the afterlife, whatever that might be, or simply to accept the fact that you are about to cease to exist upon this planet. So psychedelics and death have always had a very special connection with each other, and this cannot be ignored when we're analyzing the aspect of Odin as a psychopomp or Mercury as a psychopomp. Now, arguably, Hermes has also been associated with healing and with medicine and with caretaking, so to speak. This is, of course, a consequence of his connection to early sciences and alchemy, which, of course, further connects him to Odin, because Odin also was a sort of proto-scientist. He mixed up magic herbs and potions to perform magic, and he was a curio. He was constantly seeking new wisdom and new knowledge. So all this simply just connects them on a stronger, deeper, and more significant level. Yet also Hermes is associated with the discovery of wisdom and knowledge, as is Odin. And his staff seems to have some sort of correlation to Odin's spear. Odin's spear, Gungnir, is an absolutely outstanding aspect to the overall mythos of Odin. And in fact, most of the mythology concerning Gungnir, the spear that cannot miss its target, which means the swaying one, is lost to us. But we know from its mentions and from the implications found throughout literature that the early people, the early practitioners of this pagan mythology, had to have known the backstory. They were familiar with it. This was not a foreign aspect to it, and it seemed to have a much more significant role than we give it today. So the staff of Hermes, the Odin spear, the caduceus is what the staff of Hermes is called, and it has two snakes coiled around it. And snakes are significant because they are associated with both wisdom and knowledge, esoteric knowledge, hidden knowledge, death, and rebirth. And of course, all of these things are heavily affiliated with the extra psychical, or rather the psychedelic experience. And you might recognize the rod of Hermes or the staff of Hermes because that is our modern medical symbol. Yet Mars, Hermes, Mercury, these were not the only Greco-Roman gods that Odin is connected to. He's also now very commonly and very popularly associated with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and frenzy and poetry and creativity. And our modern understanding of Odin leads to a better parallel. Dionysus was oftentimes affiliated with wine and psychedelic substances, and his festivals historically were very looked down on. And even today, the festivals that took place around this deity seem to be a chaotic and immoral heathen fest, full of sin and debauchery of all sorts. But considering the aspect of modern Jungian psychology and the Jungian theory of shadow, this seems to be a sort of practice or applicable shadow work, where the shadow, our darker selves, our more instinctual, innate, primordial aspects are given valve. They're given a way to release the pressure that they build up, because the modern world, even in the Greco-Roman times, did not allow for the shadow to manifest itself. But as Dr. Sigmund Freud would say, all of these innate instincts have to find an expression in some way, shape, or form. If they do not, then they turn into a form of neuroses. Yet it was not just early psychology with Dr. Sigmund Freud and Dr. Carl Gustav Jung that suggested we need to express some of these innate animalistic acts, but philosophies for eons seem to be pointing to this way too. Very famously, Alan Watts in our modern times has said that we need to integrate the shadow. We need to release our orneriness, so to speak, in some way, shape, or form. So whenever we see these festivals that seem very chaotic and very heathen, barbarian-like in nature, these festivals might actually have been a logical act or a very intelligent practice. Yet to think that Dionysus is all about drunkenness and psychedelics and sex and frenzy, in other words, to correlate him with the early days of, say, Ozzy Osbourne, is a complete fallacy, and that is a fallacy of the modern day. The reality is that Dionysus was very much sophisticated, very intelligent, and very artistic. He seemed to be the god of the artists, in other words. And the ancients very well knew this. They very well had the balance corrected, where we do not today. The scales were not tipping in absolute opposition with each other, but seemed to create a harmonious balance between creativity, logic, intellect, poetry, and art, and expressing that frenzied nature that we all harbor within ourselves. A very famous play associated with Dionysus has him giving this following quote. It says, "I only mix 3 bowls of wine for the sensible man. One is for health, second is for love and pleasure, the third is for good sleep, then the wise go home. The fourth is out of our hands and belongs to outrage, the fifth to arguments, the sixth to drunken revel, the seventh to black eyes, the eighth to bailiffs. To bitter anger belongs the ninth, and 10th to insanity and madness, which makes people hurl things." So given this quote, which was in a practical play that was put on by the Greco-Roman people, Dionysus is shown preaching moderation and self-control, which is an exact opposition to the way that we depict him in our modern culture. But this depiction of self-control and moderation further connects him to Odin, because in the Havamal, Odin does not preach for people to be teetotalers. In fact, he advocates for the consumption of mead and alcoholic beverages, perhaps even psychedelics. But he preaches to do so in moderation, and only the fool takes it to excess and takes it too far. But the wise knows how to take a little and utilize it for their best interest. So this, of course, begs a philosophical question. Are the consumption of substances that alter one's mind, like alcohol, bad in and of themselves? According to Dionysus and Odin, this is not the case. When things are done in moderation and with self-control, they can actually lead to a very conducive, happy experience. They can even lead to a religious or spiritual experience. But in excess, all things tend to be bad. There's an old Native American shaman that was asked, "What is poison?" And he said, "Anything more than we need is poison." Lack of restraint is our problem, in other words. With mind-altering substances, or with food, or with work, or anything, excess is a toxin. But is alcohol and other things along these nature a toxin in and of themselves? According to these old mythologies, absolutely not. So over and over and over again, we see the preaching of moderation, and we not only see that through the Havamal, through other Eddas and sagas and so forth, but we also see this played out with their actual lifestyle, because Tacitus, in his treatise on Germania in 98 CE, tells us that they preferred trading in moderation for more practical things. They didn't want the excess and glamour, although they did have that. They created it their own way, though. They were a very artistic people. But they didn't want the things that the Romans and the Greeks and so forth found to be beautiful and profound and amazing. They wanted things that they could actually use. And in context of trading between gold and silver, they oftentimes chose silver because silver was easier to work and do things with. So the whole of their culture was based on the practices of moderation. This is severe wisdom. This is profound. This is wisdom that we could use in our modern world, most certainly. But on top of all that, we have to understand that the preachers of this wisdom, the people who relayed this wisdom to the general people, were the shamans. They were the preachers. They were the wise seers. They were the ones that people went to for guidance and advice and for navigation through their life. So this all again circles around connecting Odin to the shamans, shamans to the psychedelic experience, Odin to various other gods throughout other cultures. It's becoming to be this kaleidoscope that keeps pointing to one centralized aspect, and that is that he seems to be correlated with the psychedelic substance. Now then, in part 4, coming up soon, we're going to be discussing the nature of psychedelics, and that's where everything really begins to tie together in a phenomenal way. So be sure and check out part 4.